out shooting kingfishers this morning, both video and stills. And that's what this video is about. The kingfisher is an awesome example of a shooting scenario where shooting stills can be the way to go, but then certain action starts happening and shooting video tells the story a little bit better, or a lot better. And being able to switch between stills and video in an instant. That's what this video is about. Being able to do that, getting your setup in your camera, buttons, internal, external stuff like tripods, speed shooter harness, not because of the harness so much, because of what allows me to keep right here, all that kind of stuff, making you quick so that you get the shot more often. Shots that you may have been waiting for an entire lifetime. So if you're interested in knowing how I do it, stay tuned. This guy's not hungry anymore. He ate a whole bunch of fish before. Shooting video right now, full manual, 1/250th of a second, f8 at ISO 320, because I'm shooting 120 frames per second, slow motion video. And if I wanted to shoot stills, it's just as quick as switching this and toning down the ISO a little bit, and we're shooting stills just that fast by, on the R3 anyway, switching the button, flipping the switch right here. And it's getting bright, so let's bring up our shutter speed, 1/2500th of a second, f6.3 at ISO 800. Want to go back to video, just that quick we go back to video. And that is one of the awesome things about these cameras now, the R3, Canon R3, the Canon R5, I have it set up the same way. You can switch between videos and stills instantly. And that allows you to get the shot more often, obviously. On the R3, switching between the two is just this switch right here. It's a dedicated switch for the two modes. On the R5, it's different. It doesn't have that. It has a red button on the top. Don't do the red buttons. We'll talk about that in a minute. I have the multifunction button up here by the shutter button on the R5 set to be a toggle between video mode and stills mode. And this guy might go here. So I'm going to talk while I'm looking through the viewfinder. And being able to switch that quickly is critical. Because when that action starts and you want to go to video, you don't have time to be pushing a bunch of buttons and stuff. Well, what about the red button? That'll take you right to video. Yeah, but I don't know where the red button is on these cameras. Why deal with more buttons than you have to? So, how I have it set up for starting and stopping video is that I have the autofocus on button. The 3 back buttons are my video buttons. Just like they're set up for stills, I have them set up for video. And the autofocus on button is a toggle to start and stop video recording. And for me, that's muscle memory, and I don't have to learn new buttons, and it works great. The 3 back buttons, the next one over, the asterisk button, I have set up as a bump for the autofocus. Servo autofocus in video mode is not like it is in stills mode. And those of you who shoot video in stills know that. And so it's always moving. It's always servoing when you're in video mode. And sometimes it will be where you don't want it to be. And the servoing, oop, he's getting all excited about some other bird flying around. I'm going to start shooting some video here. And, you know, sometimes the focus isn't where you want it to be, and it takes a long time to servo back to where you want it to be. So this is a bump for me set up, and we'll go over the menus and the button setups later in the video. But anyway, that's a bump for autofocus. Boom, boom, just like that. It's on his eye, right? But now when I let go, it goes back to servo autofocus, and that's the critical thing. Okay, you got to let go and let the servo take over again, unlike with stills. Now the far right button, this button is how I have it set up to be a pause for the servo autofocus. And for me, this is like the most critical button setup I have. Why? Because servo autofocus in video on these cameras tends to drift a bit at the most inopportune time. The bird's just sitting on the perch eating a fish, banging it, and all of a sudden it'll go out of focus. Well, if you can pause it, it won't go out of focus. And then with the press of the button again, turn it back on when the bird's ready to move again, that's the way to go, because you get and keep focus better that way. Now, the R5 can be set up that way too, and I have my buttons set up exactly the same on my R5 as my R3, but the problem with the pausing and restarting autofocus on this far right back button is that on the R5 you cannot do it while you're actively capturing video. Okay, while you're recording, it won't work. You have to turn recording off, then pause it or start it, and then turning recording back on again, which is unbelievably bleh. You know, but that's just the way it works. On the R3, it doesn't work that way. On the R3, you can pause and resume servo autofocus as a toggle on this button while you're recording and while you're not recording. Much better. The R5-2's got to be set up the way the R3 is, right? It just has to be. Well, anyway, so that makes my capture of video and stills as quick as possible for me. Go back to stills, boom, like that. And I got my 3 back buttons for my different autofocus, right? Go back to video, just like that. I got my 3 back buttons for my different video applications. Start and stop video, bump autofocus, pause servo autofocus. So that's how I keep things quick out here. Now, when it comes to how I shoot, video is different than stills. When it comes to your exposures, you can't have really bright highlights or whites in video and recover them very easily in post-processing when you're shooting video like you can with stills. So if it gets really bright out, you need to have ND filters. And I'm wearing my speed shooter harness right now, not because I'm using it for stability. I'm using a tripod, obviously, with a fluid head, but because I have my pouch for my filters right here, and they're magnetic. So if I had my 1-500 on here right now, which I obviously don't, I have my 600 f4, but that's a 77mm filter that goes on the front, and it's magnetic, pop on, pop off. They're right here, really quick. Again, you need to be quick when the sun comes out, because if you're not and you're fumbling for stuff in your bag, you're gonna miss shots, right? So now you don't miss so many shots. I also have a pouch on my harness down here, and that has my extra batteries and cards. Again, no fumbling around. If I need to do that, I can do it quickly. As far as what I have set up here, just in case you're interested in it, it really has nothing to do with being quick about things, but tripod, fluid head, smooth starts and stops on my panning, which are critically important for video. Has a counterbalance for this big lens so that if I point it down, it stays down. If I point it up, it stays up. I don't want to do too much movement right now because I have a kingfisher sitting on the perch, and if he sees too much movement when he's not busy, he will fly off. But anyway, no handles on the fluid head. I put my hand on the fluid head, put my hand on the camera, and this is how I pan. Okay, handles get in the way. Can't be quick when you're all bundled up and bumping things and knocking things. Okay, so that is pretty much how I do things with the camera setup and switching quickly back and forth between video and stills. Now, when I'm done with my shoot this morning, I don't know if this guy's going to eat again. He ate a big mudfish earlier. He's pretty full. He's just hanging out on this perch because this is his perch. He just got here not too long ago, and he is establishing his foraging territory for the winter, and he keeps chasing off other kingfishers that come around. But anyway, when I'm done with my shoot here, right, we'll get back to my studio. We'll go into the menus, and I'll show you how I have things set up in there to be as quick as possible when it comes to the autofocus, tweaking that. Anyway, stay tuned. All right, we're out of the kingfisher blind and back in my studio, and we're going to jump into the menu of my Canon R3, and we're going to go over a few settings in there The settings I think you should have set up prior to going out in the field so that when you switch into that video mode, you're ready to go. Quick jump into the menu of my Canon R3, and we're talking about being quick. Quick to go from stills mode to video mode, back to stills mode as often as we need to so that we can get the shots more often. And a big part of being quick out there is that when you do switch, let's say, from stills into video, is that the menus be set up prior to being out in the field. You don't want to have to go back into these menus and do a bunch of changes when you switch from stills to video because it takes time, and to do that, you're going to miss shots if you have to do that a lot. So we want to make sure that things are pretty much set up the way we want them before we go out in the field. We should be able to anticipate pretty much what we're going to be doing that day. Most people have their stills shooting menus set up the way they want. Many of you may not have your video menu set up the way you want yet, so we'll go through that real quick, but I'm not going to go through everything in super detail here. I have other videos that go into that about shooting video on these cameras like the R3 and the R5. What I do want to show you is how I have my back button set up and a couple other things. Let's go through the menus real quick. We've got the movie record size. It's important to have that set up, ready to go. If you're going to be shooting high frame rate, it's turned on. If you turn it off here, then of course you're going to be back to like 60 frames per second. So that's a quick change that you can make. Turn it back on because I am shooting high frame rate, 120 frames per second, 4K, when I'm doing the Kingfisher work. Going through the rest of these, it's nice to have your aperture settings set to 1/8 of a stop increments rather than 1/3 of a stop, because with video you like to have a finer control over your exposures. I mentioned that earlier in the video. You need to be more correct with your exposures because you you don't have as much latitude to change your exposures in post-processing as you do with stills autofocus. This is where things get really, really important. Of course, you want movie servo autofocus turned on. I shoot zone when I'm shooting video. No eye detection, just a straight zone. It works the best for me. You can mess around with the different autofocus areas or the autofocus methods in the R5 and see which works best for you in the scenarios. But when I'm trying to track a kingfisher diving, I use zone. It works the best for me. Subject tracking is turned off because in the zone, I don't want it to switch over to tracking with the entire frame if it does pick up the bird, which it should. Okay, and that's what would happen in the R3. So that's turned off. Subject detect as animals, eye detection disabled. Like I said, switching tracked subjects. Let's go in there. Servo autofocus in video is much different than it is in stills. I'm going to harp on that. I've said it a few times already. I'm saying it again. If I'm shooting stills, it's initial priority, this setting. If I'm shooting video, now these menus are video-centric and still-centric, whichever mode you're in, which is awesome. That's why you can set them up ahead of time. Here we're in video. I want it to be kind of a more reactive autofocus behavior than I do when I shoot stills. So I've got switch track subjects bumped up to 1 rather than down on initial priority like I do for stills. Sometimes I'll bump it up to 2. Because getting on and staying on a bird when you're shooting video in the viewfinder, getting it in the autofocus zone, I want it to grab onto and switch to that subject as quickly as possible. If I'm good at staying on it, it should stay on it, even though I've kind of got the setup here set to more reactive type autofocus. But I find switching tracked subjects on 1 has worked best for me. Okay, next one over, really important, movie servo autofocus speed. I mentioned already that servoing of the autofocus when you're doing videos is much slower than servoing of the autofocus when you're shooting stills. You can change it, and I have it on fast +2 for during shoot and before shoot because I want it to move as fast as possible. It's still not super fast, but I want it to move as fast as possible. movie servo tracking sensitivity. The autofocus's tracking sensitivity. I want it on the responsive side for the same reason I talked about just a minute ago. I want my autofocus, when I get on that bird, I want it to get to that bird, focus on it, stay on it. That's the way I want it to work. A little bit different than with stills, a lot different, really. These are the settings I have and I found have worked best for me. Main point I want to make here, mess around with these settings that I've just gone over with the autofocus. Find what works best for you. It may change from scenario to scenario. Futz with these, figure out what works best for you most of the time. And set them there so that you don't have to mess with these things when you're in the field, because again, we're talking about being quick. Let's go over to buttons. How I have my buttons set up. Ooh, always go past that. You have columns for stills and columns for video. Here, we're going to concentrate on video, but you can see them side by side now. Let's go down to autofocus on. Autofocus on for video, like I said when we were out in the blind, is set for starting and stopping moving recording. It's a toggle. Got muscle memory for that button. It works well for me because in the still side of things, I'm shooting autofocus on button. That's one of my main ways of using servo autofocus. So I've got the muscle memory for that button. That makes me the quickest possible in starting and stopping. Now, if we go down to the asterisk button, that looks a lot like the autofocus on button setting I have for stills. But it doesn't work the same way, like I said earlier. It's just a bump for the autofocus. It's continually focusing in servo autofocus, but if it gets way off and I want it to refocus when like right now, I don't want to wait for it to servo or think about servoing, I hit that button. Hopefully with my subject in the center of the frame of my zone, it'll grab the subject instantly. I let go, servo takes back over again. That's a critical thing I found to have. That's why it's on the asterisk button on the back of my camera. And then if we go down to the autofocus point button, we talk about setting that up for the pause servo autofocus. Again, like I mentioned earlier in the video, critical to have the ability and an instant to pause the servo autofocus. I've got the bird in focus and it's sitting on a perch. It's not going anywhere. It's doing some cool stuff up there, eating a fish. I pause the autofocus. That way I know it's not going to go out of focus for some goofy reason, which it will do sometimes. When I think the bird's done and I think it might dive again or some other action's going to happen where he's going to be moving, I'm going to hit that button again and it's going to restart servo autofocus so I can pan with the bird and hopefully the autofocus will stay on the bird. So these critical setups that I found work best for me. We talked about the record buttons, either the red button on the R3, which is right in the middle of the switch to go between stills mode and video mode, or on the R5 it's even in a worse place up on the top of the camera in between like the the mode dial and the shutter button. I have no muscle memory for those buttons. So I like to stick with the buttons I'm using all the time, just about every day. It makes me as quick as possible in shooting, stopping shooting, keeping autofocus, hopefully maximizing my ability to get the shot when it's happening, a shot that might be something I've been waiting a long time to get. Don't want to miss that opportunity. That's pretty much the setup inside my R3. The R5 is set up very, very similar. Let's get out of the menus and we'll finish up this video. So that's basically it for this video. As always, I hope you found it at least a little bit informative. And if you did, if you like the content that I provide on my channel, please subscribe. And until next time, I hope you have great light. I hope you're getting great images. Be safe out there. I'll see you soon.